welcome back to PA Chalk Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have Glenn. How you, Glenn? How we doing?
Hey Manny, how's it going? Thank you for having me.
That's all good. So you're obviously, we can see by your top UFC Performance Institute. If you give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and how you got to the position that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess I got to preface it by saying that it's definitely been a quite winding journey. However, you know, definitely excited and very very proud to be where I'm at the Performance Institute. I'm currently a performance nutrition manager here at the UFC, and the way that I got here was so I actually ended up doing my undergrad in St. John's University. I did my dietetic internship over in Pepperdine University over in good old Malibu, which is a fantastic place to go ahead and do your dietetic internship. And then after that, I actually ended up working in clinical after I became a dietitian, which that in itself is a whole story. So I ended up becoming a dietitian around 2020, and obviously, the pandemic and all that entailed kind of threw a curveball to not only myself but just obviously a lot of different medical professionals and sports professionals as well. So I'm a fresh dietitian. I actually ended up getting a job in a hospital in Boyle Heights over in LA, and typically, you kind of get eased into the whole clinical side, and even if you're, new dietitian, definitely don't want to be kind of dropped into the chaos that is ICU floors, right, or whatnot. However, due to the pandemic that was going on, there was a lot of floors that were essentially transitioned over to ICU level care due to the basic definition that an ICU level care essentially means that they have ventilators in. And given that COVID was a respiratory condition, and the hospital that I was in was one of the main hubs in LA, that was kind of focusing on housing a lot of these patients, essentially kind of got thrown to the fire there. And which looking back, obviously that was immense experience to put on my resume. And from there on out, I got hired to another hospital a little bit closer to home, over in Simi Valley, California. And from there on out, I was able to just continue getting experience from a clinical setting. Ended up working in clinical for 2 years. Along with that, I actually had my own private practice from a sports nutrition standpoint, in which I ended up working with a lot of high school wrestlers, and also I was partnering up with this community college, that local community college, Moore Park College, and working with the football team there. So just getting reps from that area and just really immersing myself as much as I can and exposing myself, to as many different types of sports. I grew up wrestling, so I actually wrestled in my undergrad as well, collegiately. So for 4 years, which actually is what, kind of going backwards here, but it's actually what ended up sparking my interest with nutrition, was just trying to go and get that performance edge, and particularly with weight cutting, something that at the time there was, no true North Star. Um, so everybody was kind of trying to just do whatever they thought was best, right? And with that comes, a lot of definitely young ideas, but maybe not the most efficient at the time. Your classic, dehydrating way too early, classic not eating food for a couple of days. I think before the PI, a lot of us were guilty of doing that. Whoever competed, So, but I still had that spark and interest in trying to find ways of doing it a little bit more evidence based or evidence informed, right? A little bit more, you know, safe. And, if you're dehydrating yourself this far out, and it takes X amount of time, why not just put that and just get it all done the day before your competition or even the day of? And I remember, when I would go in and do that, particularly in college, I think maybe some teammates would be like, "What are you doing? You're crazy." But now it's kind of, something that resonates with a lot more athletes, and condensing the dehydration time, or at least not doing it super far in advance. It's something that pays dividends, right, in performance, and especially with the research that's out there, regarding dehydration and the effects that it has on performance. So essentially, try to pass that on, while working in clinical with the high school population, trying to give back. While I was doing that, a lot of the evidence-based approaches that I would have was essentially based off the UFC Performance Institute, which opened in 2017. They had as I'm sure you're aware, they have a journal, right? Volume one and volume two. So was definitely digging through that and trying to apply as much as I can, from that journal, and essentially the water loading recommendations, and just a little bit different because MMA, is 24 to 36 hour weigh-in windows versus wrestling is 2 hour windows, but trying to work with what you have when it comes to extrapolating evidence-based information, and yeah, just kept on trucking along, and eventually saw this opportunity for this fellowship, which is called the snip gatorade fellowship, um, which is provided by ASPDA now, formerly CPSDA. Um, and it's a fantastic fellowship. And one of the rotations that they have, or one of the options, to go and do your fellowship, is the Performance Institute. So I ended up doing my fellowship there, got matched, had an amazing 10 months, and then was offered a position as a coordinator. And shortly after, about 8 months in, was promoted to manager, and that's where I'm at now. So couple twists and turns, but yeah, here we are.
As a strength coach, we deal a lot with Excel's, spreadsheets, and building out the best program that we can for our athletes. Although, when you have these large amount of spreadsheets and Excels and printables and packs that you need to hand out to your athletes, it can get a little bit overwhelming, especially with large amount of files. Mine's personally has crashed, deleted, and that to me is a big burden. That's why since starting my own business, I've went with TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is an all-in-one programming software that has truly changed and leveled up the way I coach and the way I program for my athletes. With TeamBuildr, you can create customizable workouts, track your athletes' progress in real time, and even generate performance reports with just a few clicks. Athletes can also fill out their own workout data by using either the tablet or their smartphones in the weight room, which, most importantly, eliminates the paperwork that we all hate. This also gives your athletes accountability for their program and their progress as they are immersed within it. If you are interested in using TeamBuildr, head over to teambuildr.com and sign up using code PACHALKUP. That's PACHALKUP to start your 30-day free trial. I'm obviously not in the clinical setting like you've been in, but I also went a route that touched on general populations, and having so experienced so much of it in a clinical setting for you, how well do you think that prepared you for the turns and twists that you can come across the floor at this current position?
I think it was immense. In fact, you know, still, if whenever I speak to any young RD or aspiring future sports dietitian or even general dietitian, starting out with clinical, I think it's such an amazing base to have that translates so well. I mean, from being able to interpret labs, right? From being able to have bedside manners, to go ahead and be able to get to your point effectively. Communication details that sometimes, you know, are hard to develop unless you just have those reps. And, you know,
Soft
one
skills.
soft skills. Yeah. I mean, it really is kind of like, I don't want to simplify it this much, but it's almost like, you know, speed dating, right? You get a patient come in, you go and speak to them, and chances are you're not going to see them again. So you have that window of, say, 15 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it may be, to go and have an impact in their outcome, right? So how you go ahead and use those 5 minutes, 10 minutes to be effective is essential. And now bringing that over to sports, I mean, when it comes to having those small conversations, or I mean, having consults, or when an athlete calls you about, hey, I'm not losing weight. Well, okay, you have a health meter with any person in terms of attention span already, right? On top of that, in terms of effectiveness, you have another health meter in terms of, like, l- looking confidence. You have another health meter, and they just all kind of couple upon each other to be effective, I think. So those are definitely the most essential things I learned from clinical.
Yeah, and it's I've experienced the same thing. Is like you're also kind of at their mercy at this point as well, because if you can only get as much to them as they give to you. So for me, I learned a lot of my buy-in and how to effectively communicate with people, because I was kind of relying on them to come back in for me to get paid. So I kind of had that right. I need to make sure that it's targeting everything that you want, because I need to make you happy. Now, when I jump in a sort of sports settings where now I'm the coach and they're looking at me and they'll do whatever I want, I'm just like, okay, but let's still hit on your goals. Let's still give you that edge to make it feel like the program is still yours too.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's at the end of the day, right? You're trying to go ahead and elicit certain outcomes. If you can go ahead and couple the soft skills on top of that, right, then I think you have a complete, package to offer.
100%. With sort of your experience with high school wrestling and then going back into that setting, I've always been fascinated with wrestling because it's everywhere else in the world. It's not talked about how hard wrestling actually is, and I've personally never trained nor seen it in person. But from what I've heard and some of the coaches I know that do it, I'm just like, how is that? How are you able to fuel them for that long of training sessions and that just intensity of sessions that they go through?
Yeah, I think. Well, let me kind of do you one more. It's how do you go and fuel growing and
Mm,
developing,
developing people.
right?
Yep.
Teenagers, right? And even if they're even in college, I mean, really, there's still a lot of development to be done then. Yeah, I mean, but I think it starts with education, right? And it starts with being an example as well, and kind of using, hey, the journal is truly a large part of my base. It's like, this is what the guys at the top level are doing when it comes to fueling, when it comes to having carbohydrate intake before training, when it comes to hydrating, when it comes to ensuring that, even to a certain degree, like, overtraining is not occurring, right? Which is a whole
Hmm.
different subject. And um, if these guys, if trying to use their role models, right, whether it be like Conor McGregor, whether it be the champions, whoever it may be, trying to go ahead and show them, because it's the truth, right? If you don't go ahead and fuel properly, if you don't go ahead and go eat as many vegetables and fruits and all these things that probably kids at that age are just rolling their eyes
Hmm.
to, well, I mean, there's going to be not the best outcomes happening. Already, we are wrestling, I think, inherently already has such a demanding toll on the body. And then put on top the fact that they have to go ahead and go to school, go ahead and maybe get some lifting sessions in. All those things just kind of add up. And trying to tick so many boxes, I think the motto with that was just trying to go ahead and take what they can give you, and if you can go ahead and get some changes from these guys, that's a start, and then build upon that the next season, and build upon that the next season, because ultimately you're trying to set them up for success when it comes to sport, but more importantly, I think develop good habits around nutrition that they can have throughout life.
100%. And I think you've touched on a really good point where when you're dealing with student athletes or like high school athletes, not only are their sport demanding, but your brain also needs the calories and nutrition to fuel itself for your learning. Like that also takes time to get fueled properly. And how is that managing from sports and then the sort of collegiate side of now they've also got education and they're running in between classes and the stressors that go on to that as well.
Yeah, well, I think it starts working backwards, right? Like, what is the main detriment to somebody? Like, what is the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to um, uh, what can we fix that will go ahead and already improve their way of living and in turn improve their academic performance? Well, that's going to be not cutting too early, not dehydrating themselves too early. You know, I think a lot of wrestlers, one of the best things that you develop from wrestling is just this grit and just this
Mm,
go getter attitude, where it's like, damn the torpedoes, I'm going after it. Like, and frankly, it does get glorified. It is part of kind of like the same way that cauliflower ears, are kind of like this badge of honor. It's like, hey, nobody sees how hard we work. Nobody sees how much we're suffering. However, you know, your teachers do see how much you're suffering, and you do see your grades at the end of the school year. So if you can go ahead and maybe not be dehydrated 5 days out from your competition, and then do it all over again the next week, and then do it all over again the next week. Okay, we've already fixed something that's quite easily fixable, right? And now you're a lot more comfortable. You're not uncomfortable, sitting in class and just worrying about your weight. Well, maybe you are worrying about your weight, but you're not at least dehydrated.
mhm,
Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is going to be calories. Okay, how much are we cutting? Right. So are you trying to just literally eat like 1,200 calories and because you're at a weight class that you shouldn't be at? Okay, then, if you're in high school, you probably shouldn't be cutting more than 5% of your body weight, at most. I mean, I would even argue 3%, right? Should be more about skill development, should be more about, letting your body do what it's going to
mhm,
do when it comes to developing, putting on muscle mass. Sure, there's going to be outliers and people that can go ahead and cut more weight, and have beneficial outcomes. But ultimately, I think that's something that should be left more to a collegiate setting, once you already know how your body responds. You already know a lot of feeling patterns. Hopefully, by that point, you already know, and you're not just doing it just because you have to fill in a spot on the roster, or you have to go ahead and you're just trying to do it because everybody else does it. If that makes sense.
yeah, with the sort of ability for your brain to function dehydrated, what's your sort of thoughts and feelings towards how important that hydration is to brain function, and what happens when you start reducing that weight and water? How does that affect your sort of brain capacity?
Well, I mean, it's gonna be such a critical component. I mean, fluid, obviously, quite important to ensure that you have enough brain function. Exactly. Yeah. Cheers to that. I mean, it's as simple as, right, the incidence of knockouts increases, right, when you're with athletes who are more dehydrated, right, etc. These type of concepts translate also to the classroom. Um, Simple as 2 to 3% of dehydration of your body weight loss and dehydration can go ahead and impair cognitive performance, right? And a lot of people don't realize that that's not too much. In fact, typically, when you realize you should probably drink water, you're already like at 1 to 2% dehydration. So obviously, thankfully, we have that mechanism. But not only does your cognitive performance decline, but also like, you're uncomfortable, right? Like, nobody wants to
Mhm,
take a test. Nobody wants to go ahead and be in class, slightly dehydrated. And um, how do we fix that? Well, it starts with hydrating during practice. The amount, again, the intensity and the physical demand of wrestling practices in which they train with sweats and sweatshirts and sweatpants, all of a sudden you're 4% dehydrated at the end of training, maybe didn't drink water. Well, now you have to catch up, but you have to go to bed. And then you go to bed, dehydrated, wake up. Now you're in a deficit. It's a cascade of events that manifest one way or another in the classroom.
How does sort of translate to your current role with the UFC PI?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I think that philosophy has been pretty fizzled out when it comes to the professional MMA game. In fact, now it's thankfully a lot of athletes essentially subscribe to the idea or the philosophy of water loading, right?
Mm-hmm.
In which if you go ahead and increase your water intake in the days leading up to the weigh-in, you can go ahead and increase your urinary losses and also increase your sweat rate. Simply because you just have so much water in your system. And actually, Dr. Reed Reel, who is the performance nutrition director over in the PI in Shanghai, has a lot of great research on this. But by increasing your fluid intake throughout the week, starting say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday at 100 mLs per kg, and then reducing it to 50
Okay.
mLs per kg on Thursday, so the day before weigh-ins, um, your body, essentially gets so used to that high fluid intake and this increase in urinary losses that by the time that you start dehydrating yourself, you're essentially riding that wave, right? In which, sure, you're dehydrated, but you're still helping your body out, helping that dehydration process by still being able to pee, and help the not allow the body to get in this super stressed, restrictive state in which it
Mm-hmm.
reduces sweat losses and urinary losses.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I've sort of spoke to Ali Vandenberg about, she's the nutritionist at the Alabama football now, is
Hmm.
that you also lose your ability to use your peripheral vision.
Oh,
So
sure.
as you become more dehydrated, your sort of vision narrows. How crucial is that for you to tell them and sort of make them realize how important it actually is to be hydrated throughout their camps?
Yeah, I mean, it's essential, right? Again, it's fortunately, I think the amount of dehydration that occurs for them to make weight kind of has this effect in which during camp I would even argue that a lot of the MMA athletes are probably some of the most hydrated athletes during camp
Okay.
until they don't until they
They have
have
to cut weight.
yeah. Overall, it probably is the same amount as all the other sports, but I think that they're just like, yeah, I actually went through that myself, where it's as soon as I was done with my wrestling career, I actually thought that I had like diabetes. I just kept using the restroom nonstop. Well, it turned out that I actually just
You were drinking
kind
more
of,
water than you
yeah, I
needed.
was drinking more water than I needed, because as soon as I was done, I was like, I will never, um, what's it called? It's underappreciate water ever again. So that was actually a whole psychological shift that actually a lot of athletes go through. But that's not a problem very, very rarely. If
Mhm.
anything, it's more trying to ensure that electrolytes are part of their hydration, right?
Yeah,
But in order to go ahead and see the accurate weight descent of an athlete, we actually like for them to be hydrated, and that's essentially non-negotiable with a lot of these athletes to ensure that they're hydrated. So very, very rarely do we actually see um, athletes with that. So I can't speak too much on that.
yeah. Can you talk about electrolytes and how you why you would say that's important for athletes in sort of any sport?
Yeah, electrolytes, particularly sodium, right, which is going to be the main electrolyte. Out of magnesium, potassium, all of those, which are all going to have essential roles in just the body's functions. But in particular, sodium. Without sodium, you're not going to allow the water to get into the cells, right? So um, if you go ahead and drink, water, sure, you're putting water in your body, but you're not really kind of giving it its access pass to go ahead and adequately hydrate, right? And I think it starts when we try and educate the athletes, it starts with identifying what truly means hydration, right? Does it mean just drinking water and peeing clear? Well, I think it goes a little bit more beyond that. It goes ensuring that the water can actually be used. And where is it going to be used? Well, it's going to be used in your cells. Okay. How do we get it in? Okay. Sodium, right? That's going to go ahead and help, with the hydration status. So if we work backwards, right, we
Hmm.
have to make sure that we're getting adequate amounts of sodium. And that number can differ how much sodium is appropriate from one athlete to another. But one of the, I guess, education pieces, particularly in our population, is hey, sodium is making me retain water. It's making me, gain weight. It's like, yeah, actually, that means that you're properly hydrated, and that is your true weight.
Hmm.
And that is okay. Right now, we have a athlete who is actually performing at their optimal, capacity, as opposed to somebody who is performing at a suboptimal capacity and is already dehydrated. In fact, during fight week, we cut out sodium to go ahead and get that artificial weight shift in which we lose non-essential body mass, for that same reason. And the intensity of the training sessions are way low. All they're focusing on during fight week is just making weight, right? So, and that's one of the things that we try and kind of present to them and be like, okay, are we trying to make weight, or are we trying to perform to the best of our abilities and lose actually body mass, right? Fat. So, as opposed
Hmm.
to just water.
That's kind of what I was wanting to speak about. Is with a sport like MMA, you are so focused on that weight and that retention of weight that you sometimes don't want to introduce sodium because it does obviously raise your body weight. But like you said, it's in a healthily way. How do you get around some of those conversations with them and being like I know you're gaining weight, but sodium is actually beneficial to retain that water so then you can utilize it for your actually performance.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's an education piece, and more importantly, laying it all out, right? Like, what is sodium? What are calories? What are vitamins? What are minerals? And again, bedside manners, right? Obviously, this is going to be
Mhm.
something that can get pretty lost. You can get pretty lost in the weeds with this. However, it's as simple as if you go ahead and are in a calorie deficit, right? You can go ahead and lose weight, right? If you go ahead and have enough protein in that calorie deficit, chances are you'll lose more fat than protein, right? And I
Mhm.
think that's something that's pretty easy to get across. But once we start talking about sodium, that's something that gets a little bit more lost because it's like, hey, wait a second. I just cut out sodium and I lost 4 pounds. Like, this is the best thing ever. This is easy. I can just keep cutting sodium and I'll keep losing weight. And that's probably the most difficult to get across. But using the example of fight week, right?
Mhm.
How, okay, sodium you can cut out in fight week because you're not sparring, you're not training 2 to 3 times a day at high intensities. Okay. If you were to be doing that during fight week, you'd probably be cramping, right? Which I think everyone has experienced that. I think once they start putting that together, they kind of start realizing that, oh, okay, so there are consequences to not having enough electrolytes. And some people may be able to get away with it, but ultimately, um, the amount of food that they're eating during camp compared to fight week in terms of volume, can also provide quite ample amount of electrolytes as well. So at times it seems like they're getting away with it, but just trying to hammer it down, I should say, the importance of sodium, by using the fight week analogy and also the
Mhm.
cramping. And again, do we want to go ahead and have a
Yeah, nutrient to
sustainable,
what?
yeah,
Yeah.
sustainable weight descent or not? Because it works the other way, right? If you go ahead and have a weekend you go to a wedding, right? And all of a sudden you eat a whole bunch of food, that's pretty high in carbs, pretty high in salt, and then you weigh yourself on a Monday. Well, chances are you're going to gain 4 pounds, right? But it's not actually that you gain 4 pounds of fat or anything. It's just that you just are retaining more water, and there's a fine balance
Mhm.
in that.
So the lead up to fight night is coming, and obviously you weigh in 24 hours beforehand.
Mhm.
What is the recommendations after weigh in, and how do they get back up to a somewhat normal walking weight, having just cut all of that?
That's a great question. I mean, it's we joke around about you know the sport that we do. It is quite uncharted territory when it comes to what interventions we're doing and how do we go and reverse them, right?
It's also
Because
individual as well, which I presume it's giving you a lot of headaches as well.
yeah, sorry, what was that?
It's also very individual, so it can give you some headaches as well. I'm presuming.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised. I think as a team, we've been able to standardize a lot of the interventions to you know, again, there's going to be a lot of individuality, a lot of differences from athlete to athlete, but the amount that we've been able to standardize a lot of these interventions is pretty astounding for how, at one point, complicated and tall of a mountain this was to climb. But to answer your question, so during fight week, we go ahead and take away or reduce sodium, reduce carbohydrate intake, and eliminate fiber intake, right? And the first two are going to be um, due to trying to reduce the fluid retention, right, and trying to reduce the non-essential body mass, as we like to call it. Same with fiber intake. If we can go ahead and reduce the amount of gut contents that there is,
Mm.
similar to a bowel prep protocol that may be followed in a clinical setting, we can go ahead and account for an additional 1 to 2% of body weight. And athletes will often lose, 1 to 1.5% of body weight from day to day in fight week. So once they weigh in, obviously they have low glycogen stores and low electrolyte reserves, if you will. So knowing that out of those three nutrients that we took away, fiber, sodium, and carbohydrate or glycogen stored form, only two of them are performance nutrients. So we go ahead and replenish them with ample amounts of electrolytes. Actually, we follow the weight descent that they're following throughout that they
Mm.
are engaging in throughout fight week. And then we reverse calculate the amount of fluid that essentially they need, the amount of electrolytes that they need, and we provide it in a isotonic solution. Since their gut will typically be a little bit messed up just from not for receiving a reduced volume of food, a reduced, potentially reduced amount of calories, and the heat stress that they endure during the weight cut. So we'll slowly ease them back into rehydrating first and foremost. But then on top of that, we'll also focus on replenishing the glycogen stores. And we typically aim in a slow process, but we typically aim for about 10 grams per kg, 8 to 10 grams per kg of carbohydrate intake on Friday, and then come fight day, it's more of still high carbohydrate foods and low fiber, but more of a eat the way that you typically would eat in a sparring session, since
Mm.
that's where the individual nature really, really varies. Some people like to fight a little bit fuller than others, or some people like to fight completely empty, on an empty stomach, and it just depends.
Yeah, with the sort of weight cuts, what is the sort of rule to thumb on that point of diminishing return where now they're causing more damage, and then the sort of it gets called off because they're probably not in a healthier state now.
Yeah. Ultimately, when engaging in a weight cut, I think the safety of the athlete is first and foremost the main priority. And I mean, I think this is where you have that whole interdisciplinary nature, applied even
Mm.
more so, right? So during weight cuts, for events in Vegas, we'll go ahead and have somebody from sports med along with us, monitoring athletes. Typically athletes don't actually cut as much weight as reported. It'll be like 4 to 5% on average of their body weight, which is great, and this is on top of already reducing their non-essential body weight. But to answer your question, if there is a point, right, in which the athlete's safety is compromised, and that can manifest itself in many, many different ways. um, And typically this is going to look in the form of, overheating. It can be in the form of maybe dizziness, things that are just synonymous with pushing your body a little bit too far. That is the point where the athlete's safety needs to be taken into question and assessed, and see if this is something that's viable. It is something tough
Mhm.
um, to assess,
Tell someone,
mainly
yeah,
because this is their livelihood, right? And this is something that's very important. If they end up missing weight, depending where they are, they may get fined. But if they're over a certain limit, like say 4 or 5 pounds, it differs from commission to commission, but the fight might be called off. A lot of different stipulations that go into it, but I think ultimately seeing the athlete's longevity and seeing the athlete's best interest health wise is first and foremost. Hopefully, I answer
yeah,
with that.
yeah, yeah. No, it does. Because I've always wondered, like, you hear it quite often with some of the bigger sort of named athletes losing out in the fight because of their weight cut and they're too dehydrated, or they're
Yeah,
just not looking great for what they need to go on and do the day after. And I've
yeah,
always wondered, like, what's that conversation like with sort of you guys and the athletes, and how essentially it could have been different had they had more preparation in there.
yeah, and it starts again. It starts with education, right? It starts all the way from the time that somebody accepts a fight, right? So we like to recommend being 16% over the weight division to start a camp, an 8-week camp. That way, about 1%, 0.5 to 1% of their body weight's lost per week, which, depending on the weight class, can be as little or as much as a pound to, half a pound or more than that, right? So it starts with that, right? And I think that preparation can never be enough, you
Mm,
know. And again, if we're talking about performance, if we're talking about how which version of yourself wants to go and step on that cage, the recovery time compared to the amount that you cut is very important, right? Because in wrestling, if you go ahead and cut the same amount that MMA athletes do, well, you're not going to perform too well. Simply, there's just not enough time to recover. But in MMA, sure, you can get away with a little bit more, but there also is a limit, right? Only because you can do it does not mean that you're going to have the same outcome if you came in way
mm,
heavier X time compared to Y time, So, yeah, it starts with education. It also, which modality are you using to cut weight, right? Are you being smart about your weight cutting tactics? Are you doing it the old school way and just running and, putting sauna suits on and then going to the sauna on top of that and overheating yourself? And when you could have maybe just ran with a sauna suit and then gone to a sauna or maybe a bathtub, jacuzzi, something that's a little bit more milder. And the bathtub is controlled with a thermometer and doesn't get past 104, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Like that is probably a lot more of a efficient way of cutting weight instead of just redlining it the whole way through to the point that it's just not sustainable for X amount of hours that you need to make X amount of
yeah,
weight.
100%. And it's always that thing where you obviously don't see what's all going on in the background with sort of these weight cuts for everyone. In
Yeah.
terms of after weigh-ins, and I've seen this from like the UFC's YouTube videos and stuff, where they usually get goodie bags. I've always wondered what's all in those goodie bags. Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah. So you're talking about the brown bags, right? That they get.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the brown bags. So that's actually going to be the rehydration beverages that we provide to them, and on top of that, we also provide them with um, carb reloading items.
Mm,
So one bag is going
yeah.
to be the rehydration beverage that we talked about, um, but we actually have a super close integration. Um, with a culinary team. So we actually travel, with the culinary team. And I
Wow.
mean, these guys are, you know, the I always say like the work that they do is truly second to none. Because I mean, not only do they have to be well versed in their culinary, I guess practice, but more importantly, they have to go ahead and take that and flip it on its head. And okay, now cook without sodium. Now cook without carbs. Now, who goes to become a chef, then all of a sudden gets told, "Hey, forget everything that you learned, and now try and make something that's delicious for athletes that are cutting weight, but you can't use carbs or you can't use sodium." Like, it's almost like telling, you know,
A strength
there
coach to go into the gym and not lift weights.
you go, there you go. Which that in of itself is a whole different topic, which I'm sure Becky shed some amazing light in. And again, we all
Happy
kind
day.
of have to do a degree of that when it comes to MMA. But hats off to anybody in this field who has to go and get rid of their shield and sword, right? But to answer your question, the goodie bag actually includes, since we're trying to replenish the glycogen stores, and that's kind of when they have the liberty of doing whatever they want and having high carb foods such as mochi cake. We're actually
Ooh.
rolling out, yeah, it's quite delicious. We're actually rolling out this cinnamon cinnamon,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, cinnamon roll,
Cinnamon roll. Yeah.
yeah, cinnamon roll, and we'll do what else? Like a banana bread, as things that are
Oof.
high carb, high sodium. They'll go ahead and add a little bit more sodium by mixing it with a little bit of miso sauce. And honestly, it's quite dangerous because we won't be cutting weight, but we'll go ahead and save some for ourselves as well.
As you should.
As we
As you
should,
should.
as we should. No. But on top of that, we'll also have dishes that are high carb as well. Like pasta, rice, in which literally like 80% of the dish is just all carbohydrate. So um, anything to go ahead and lessen the burden that the athletes need to go through to go and step out in the cage as ready as possible.
Mhm. That's amazing. Like, I think the UFC itself has, obviously, it's one of the fastest growing and most successful sports today. If we talk about like the things that you have been able to achieve, but having so many teams operate and then make this collective of like, let's get our athletes not only ready for what's about to happen, but afterwards as well.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, until they get into that cage, I don't think anyone's work is done. From sports medicine to nutrition to S&C, right? I mean, and I think it truly is a testament to the attention to detail that we have, because it otherwise could have been very easy to just be hands off,
Mm,
right? I think sports medicine probably a little bit harder, but from nutrition and even S&C and um, different disciplines, it's we still do an effort to go ahead and make sure there is nothing that's too much effort, right? There's nothing that's too much of a no. All these details matter. At the end of the day, it is a professional competition, and trying to ensure that no stone is left unturned
yeah.
is something that I think we all hold quite close to our hearts.
Yeah. In terms of sort of after fights, obviously concussion rates in the UFC are very prevalent due to the nature of the sport. Um,
Yeah.
how does the nutrition look at like afterwards? Obviously, I've spoken with Olivia where she mentions that nutrition's quite valuable for that, but also the amount of like training you do afterwards sort of dictates on how that goes. And sort of your sense of things, how do you use, what's a protocol for the concussions post event?
So we've actually been rolling out this brain health initiative that I'm sure Olivia spoke about, which has been something that has truly made a big impact in the athlete's recovery. So from our side during check-ins on Tuesday, we'll go ahead and give the athletes a handout, which essentially lays out right the a flow chart of if you have X symptoms, do Y, right? If you still have X symptoms, do Y, and essentially something that it's like having a sports medicine consultant, right there, right then and there. Ultimately, the symptoms that the athlete has after the fight is going to gear a lot of the decisions, right, that need to be taken based on that handout. However, when they're done with their fight, they also go to the backstage, right, in which they go and get seen by the sports medicine team and go and get evaluated. And from there on out, I'm sure Olivia can speak a lot more to that. But from a nutrition standpoint, we give them a supplement called Cinequil, which is a brain health supplement, and it's actually the main ingredient is ketones, right? So along with that, it also provides a couple of anti-inflammatory ingredients such as like curcumin, and also has some omega 3s, um, in which they can go ahead and combine the supplement with the other supplements that they get for fight week, which is additional omega 3s, probiotics, melatonin, and a multivitamin. And all together, now we have a pretty nice, yep, that's the one. And altogether, we have a pretty nice brain health supplement protocol, which essentially, kind of targets at a pretty general, I guess, symptoms, when it comes to protecting, your brain. Now, even if the athlete hasn't had, doesn't have a concussion or whatnot, or doesn't have evident, continue, even if it was a quick match, right, or a quick fight, the amount of damage that is sustained throughout fight camp, I think that's more importantly something that we're trying to shine light onto,
Mm,
right? It's probably a good thing to go ahead and kind of take a week off, or two, and just kind of focus on just getting, at least protecting your brain. I mean, you only get one ultimately, and doing that afterwards, I think is of the best interest of the athlete. In fact, when an athlete ends up having, concussions, essentially what ends up happening is that there is a downregulation of glucose utilization by the brain, so which is the main fuel source for the brain. So if we can go ahead and supplement with an alternative fuel source, which this supplement ends up having, then we're helping the resolution of inflammation, take place, and get that brain to heal appropriately.
nice. See, like I have had a couple of concussions, and obviously none of this information was around back then.
Yeah, not fun.
So
Yeah.
yeah, no, not fun at all. Um, but so it always gets me curious on how to effectively recover the brain from such a traumatic event where essentially your lights are completely shut off. You're not always, but mostly you're completely gone. And then how to have healthfully sort of build up that brain function and capacity afterwards. And I think, like Olivia mentions, like really making sure that you're doing your ABCs. Like your nutrition you have to now fuel to recover that brain. And I was unaware of the Cinequel and how that can sort of impact on the performance of the brain function.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's another component that's pretty key, right? Which I like to think that because of the large deficit that they were in during fight camp, inherently that'll be built in, which is the fueling to go ahead
Mm,
and help out the inflammation. In fact, I mean, I remember when I was in clinical, if there was a patient that had a TBI, I mean, the amount of calories that that person is burning as a result of the cascade of events that occurs due to that TBI, I mean, it's ridiculous. You definitely need a lot more calories, a lot more carbohydrates to go ahead and help out, keep up with the consequence and the inflammation demand that
mm,
that concussions bring, right? And if an athlete is diagnosed with a concussion, we do have a separate protocol that is a little bit more heavier duty, as that requires a lot more tailored attention, if you will. And it's all the same supplements, but a heavier dosage of omega 3s.
Mm,
And then that's when we kind of start focusing more on, okay, making sure that absolutely, you know, we're not still trying to diet. We're not still trying to look at the next fight, that you have going on. It's time to go and recover and provide the fuel that your body needs now instead of training, but more as a recovery.
yeah. What would be some of your advice towards like nutritionists or coaches sort of in this industry or coming into this industry?
I would say for somebody who's trying to wear so many different hats, which is this job that we have, I think it's important to be well versed with the different areas of nutrition, right? So somebody who's trying to be a sports dietitian in an MMA setting, I think it's important to have a good clinical background. And I think I'm a little bit biased, but the amount of help that it's given me is been quite substantial. That'd be one of the things. The other thing, I think, immerse yourself in the sport, right?
Mm,
Immerse yourself in, for those students that are not too familiar with this space. I mean, I think there's so much about training, so much about cutting weight, about dieting that you truly can't experience or learn about, unfortunately, because there's not going to be many clinical books about how to cut weight or what symptoms to look for, so I think it provides a large invaluable experience.
mm,
From a coach's standpoint, I would say, you know my suggestion would be sometimes less is more, when it comes to um, not necessarily overtraining, but creating that calorie deficit. Sometimes it's okay to go ahead and have more carbohydrates to go ahead and fuel the athlete's training so that in turn they burn more calories and then in turn they recover faster. They can keep going and actually lose the weight that they may need to. Um, or even they might not need to lose weight. They just trying to get the best outcome. But sometimes I think in having a smaller calorie deficit
mm.
can go ahead and become a more sustainable weight descent and not lead to that crash.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And as well as like, obviously, not all programs have the ability to have a dietitian or nutritionist there with them. So I'm always thinking about how we as coaches and strength coaches and sports coaches or whatever can
Yeah.
know the foundation or basics to help our athletes enough.
Yeah. And if I may add another one here, I think, for coaches and strength coaches, if able to work with a dietitian, or at least have a dietitian in within the ecosystem, whether it be, um, you know, somebody who you can just reach out to have XYZ questions, which I immediately volunteer my hand up, as a resource to anybody. But feel free to, bounce ideas off of dietitians. I mean, I know that we over here do it all the time, and it helps out tremendously and being on the same page because ultimately, there's only so many hours in the day, and obviously, I think we're all pretty curious about trying to elicit good outcomes, but you know it's better to just kind of meld the minds together and trying to pursue the best interests of an athlete.
100%, I agree. And again, I appreciate you for coming on and just like really diving into what you do and how different situations of your sort of industry goes into really making sure that the athletes have the best outcome for themselves. Um, so I do really appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely, yeah. I can't believe it's already 54 minutes. It flew by.
But
So
it
thank
goes
you for
quick.
having me.
It does go quick. But like it's like I find it very interesting speaking to different coaches and different sort of high performance personnel because like you learn something new every single time and you also have a different way of looking into your programming or considerations that you then implement from then on.
Absolutely, no. Yeah, it's having those different inputs is quite critical. So I mean, it's been great to hear, from your end as well, as little as it was, but still good to see, that response, and thank you for having me.
No, it's all good. If you just let everyone know where they can catch you and sort of bounce some ideas off you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Instagram works fine. G Castro RDN is my handle, and yeah, feel free to contact me through there, even through email. My email is glenncastro31 at gmail.com, and that's Glenn with two N's,
I'll link
which
to it in the description.
perfect. Yeah, glenncastro31 at gmail.com.
Perfect. No, thank you so much for that. And yeah, peace.